The only shell that sounds like it makes sense is like a Sapphire Amber Control deck, which is a very weird thing to say because Sapphire Amber is not naturally even a good ink combination. Not naturally even a good ink combination. Look, I can't get everything right. I mean, can you even blame me? Look at this list. 28 characters, 32 non-characters. Most of the characters are tiny and can't really get involved in combat. This deck can't possibly work. And I'll have you know, I'm not the only one that doubted this deck. Check out Harlan's Suite, for example.
You say to me, I think blue-yellow control is a very good deck. I'm going to laugh at you a little bit and say I don't believe it's a very good deck.
Though it has to be said that just 2 days later, even Harlan's Suite changed his mind.
I don't actually know where the blue-yellow deck design is at because all I seem to do is make memes about them, but I think it is a real deck and it will be sticking around.
Having played the deck, I think that I need to eat crow because the deck is good. Like, really good. But how? And why? And why am I not in it? You're not in it because you're not a good card, Simba. But as for the other questions, that's what we're talking about in today's video. What makes Amber Sapphire tick? So first things first, it's all about Raging Storm. Turns out an 8-cost bot wipe, still pretty good. For those not in the know, the reason why this card is good is because it gives you a hard reset when the bot falls too far behind for you. And in doing so, you tend to get a 3-for-1, a 2-for-1, a 4-for-1. You spend 1 card, you kill 4 of their things, they spend 4 cards to play their stuff, so in that sense you're up on cards because you played the Raging Storm. This is especially impactful because in Core Constructed currently, almost every single deck is board dependent. Essentially, they need a wide board or they need a board lead in order to win the game. Classic example of this is Blurple, the premier mid-range deck of the format. Can't win a game if it cannot hold a board together for at least several turns. In fact, if we look at the Whispers in the Well Set 10 metagame that just passed, there are only 2 decks that I would say have elements that are not board dependent. The first is Emerald Amethyst Burn, because this deck aims to play characters, very cheap characters, only in the first 3 to 4 turns of the game, turn all of them sideways, get up to like 12, 13 lore, and close the game out using items like the Staticaster, Amethyst Chromicon to draw cards, and play a whole bunch of direct lore gain from the hand, like Honey Maron, like the White Rose, like Gathering Knowledge and Wisdom, like Gogo Tamago. The second deck is Emerald Sapphire because it plays Bend to My Will, and in combination with Mother Knows Best or You're Welcome. Though keep in mind, because the deck only plays 1 or 2 copies of Bend to My Will and needs a character to sing one of those songs to make the card really impactful, it's only slightly not board dependent. It still requires having value gaining characters like Clarabelle and Basil in order to win the game. So far, it looks like Set 11 Winterspell is going to be another board based metagame, and in such a metagame, a 8-cost board clear is definitely going to be at least good, and from play it turns out to be very good. Of course, playing an 8-drop isn't trivial for every deck, but that's the second strength of the deck. It has the ramp to support playing an 8-drop in a fairly timely fashion. Of course, it's a Sapphire deck, so it plays Tipo, Sail, Cinderella, and Cinderella herself is supported with the Princess package with Eilonwy and Moana. So with a Cinderella in play, you play another princess, you get another quote-unquote free ink off of the Cinderella. Moana herself also helps you get to higher inks without losing cards from your hand because you can ink the cards from your discard. So in that sense, it's similar to Cinderella. And in this deck, because you're playing 31 actions, you're going to have stuff in your discard to use with Moana. As an aside, this is the deck so far in the metagame that really showcases Moana's power. The deck has so much top end that you really can never have too much ink. You know, you often want to get up to like 12, 13, 14 ink, and Moana lets you get up those crazy ink numbers without losing too many resources from your hand in order to get to that point. The third strength of the deck is that it has sufficient card advantage to support playing Raging Storm. So after you play Raging Storm, you spend 8 ink, you likely can't do anything else on a turn, your opponent gets to play a bunch of things, then if they suspect a Raging Storm is coming, they would send back certain cards in their hand. After your Raging Storm, they'll start playing a bunch of stuff. So you can't be empty-handed, you need to have stuff in your hand in order to play to combat this board presence that your opponent will be putting forward post Raging Storm. And in this deck, you have plenty of ways to draw cards. You have Pete 5, which is fantastic. You have Stitch 7, which can draw 2 cards on the correct board. You have Ohana Means Family, which is slightly conditional but is pretty solid in this deck because there are a lot of characters with high willpower. So you have Stitch, 8 willpower, Pete, 5 willpower, Hades, 6 willpower. If you can draw 2, 3 off of it, that's kind of good enough per Ohana Means Family, and even if it doesn't work, it's always inkable and you can throw it away. Decent card in this deck. And of course, we get to the biggest endgame grind engine of it all. Black Cauldron, baby. Yes, finally Black Cauldron sees some play. It is the endgame machine of the deck. Unfortunately, in this list that I'm looking at, it only plays 1 copy. I'm not sure if it can go up to support 2 because of the uninkable situation, and it's often a dead card before you even get to like 12 ink. But just imagine against an opponent that can't remove your characters without banishing them. You play a Hades, they find a way to kill your Hades, you put it under the Black Cauldron, do something else, following turn you get to Hades them again, and this goes on forever and ever. If they say in the mirror match Raging Storm away your board, you can start tucking characters under the Black Cauldron and bringing them back, and if they wipe again, you can bring them back again, albeit over 2 turns. So it's not the fastest engine to convert to value, but it is the one that will eventually win the game if your opponent cannot answer it. And at the point where you're going to be doing Black Cauldron stuff, you're going to have like 12 to 14 ink, 15 ink. I've been up to like 22 ink before in this with this deck. You are going to have enough ink to do all of the things you want to do. And the last reason, and to me I think the most critical reason why this deck is even remotely functional, much less good at all, is that it has a very efficient removal package. It plays the Horseman Strikes, which is great against a lot of Amethyst decks, which are all over the metagame. It plays World Greatest Criminal Mind, which is great against Pete, when everybody's playing Pete. And Demonas, of course, and Clarabelles, if you see them, and so forth. It plays Let It Go, Universal Removal Song. It has a lot of characters that can sing them. Even Ink Runner, to some extent, is a pretty efficient way to remove evasive characters because they tend to be smaller than your characters because, you know, evasives tend to be not very large. And of course, Hades, Infernal Schemer, one of the most efficient removal character 2-for-1s that exists in core constructed currently. Without this removal package, the deck is not remotely close to functional because after a Raging Storm, they play things, well, the cards in your hand that you're going to be deploying to claw back the board, a lot of them are going to be these cheap removal actions that you can use. And that's where the deck gets a lot of its strength because, as we know, the characters are not good at challenging, the characters are weak, it needs power elsewhere, and the power comes in its removal. As an aside, because the deck plays so many actions, like 31, and the last one, the 32nd card, is the Black Cauldron, against specifically Mowgli from Amber, if you really need to spooky side them, like on turn 4 or turn 5, your spooky side is very easy to protect because you can always ink in a way that you would be able to have a spare non-character card to discard to the Mowgli. So another cool strength of the deck that you may not necessarily have observed without actually playing with it. So then, what are the deck's strengths? Clearly, it's grinding out long games. Against mid-range decks that are board dependent, this deck is pretty darn good. Against Amethyst in particular, because they are fairly board-based color with Genies, Elsas, Demonas, Dumbos, the decks playing these cards suffer quite immensely against Raging Storm, and if you add in Horseman Strikes as well, dang. I will note that Zen Syed did post on his Versus series on his YouTube channel, an Amber Sapphire matchup played by Jeremy Bertroni against Zen playing Blurple, and Zen took that series 2-0. I think that comes down to the deck build of the Amber Sapphire because he's playing cards like Lilo 5, which is weak against Blurple due to Elsa, due to Demona, due to Into the Unknown, and so forth. And also he's playing Scrooge McDuck as an uninkable 2-drop that doesn't really have that many targets in Blurple and doesn't fit very nicely in the curve. The list that I'm playing, posted by Machiavelli HS, where on Twitter he showed some pretty immense results playing this exact list, I think is very, very good against Blurple. And even though I haven't tested this matchup myself personally, I do suspect that this deck is going to be strong against Emerald Sapphire as well if that comes up, because Raging Storm is just the ultimate board clear, and the only thing that you really have to be scared of is a Bend to My Will. Alright, what about the deck's weaknesses? Well, looking at the list, it clearly should be aggro. And the 2 aggro decks that people are trying out early now in this Winterspell metagame is Amber Emerald Dogs and Amber Steel. Well, you would think that the deck is bad against dogs, but if you take a look again at a different one of Zenside's versus series where he played dogs, albeit a suboptimal list against Jeremy Bertroni playing Amber Sapphire, the games weren't very pretty, but the Amber Sapphire deck took the series 2-0. Of course, we should note that Jeremy was playing 3 spooky sites in his deck, which obviously is very good against dogs. I think the match on the versus series showed one of dogs or that particular dog's list's weaknesses. It doesn't actually accumulate lore very quickly. What do you mean dogs doesn't gain lore very quickly? Well, if anyone that played against dogs knows, the early characters that they play don't really turn sideways. They don't gain lore fast at the start because they tend to be very fragile. They will die to any of opposing characters, so they sit there to set up for the Tramp 7 when it comes down. Only after Tramp 7 comes down, digs for something, they play that something, maybe Emerald Chromicon, maybe a Mowgli. Only then at that point do they start questing and they try and close the game out in 2 turns. But up to that point, they don't actually gain that much lore, which gives you time for your spooky sites to come into play and have a good effect on the game and keep your opponent at a low lore total. And also, it doesn't really survive a board wipe because it doesn't play Lady 5. It also doesn't have Gogo Tamago for reach to close the game out even though you don't have the board at the end of the game as well. So if you're a dogs player and Amber Sapphire is something you want to beat because this should be a good matchup for you, right? This kind of slow deck is precisely why you play dogs. Well then, maybe Lady 5 and Gogo Tamago should come back into the deck. Of course, dogs is not the only aggro deck. As I mentioned, there's Amber Steel, which is floating around, and Amber Steel, based on the cards that are available, looks like it aggressively gains lore quite fast and therefore might be able to topple this Amber Sapphire deck quite easily, I would think, assuming you're playing less than, 4 or 3 spooky sites. One particular matchup that I face is Emerald Amethyst Burn, and that matchup is completely horrendous. I think it's like 5 to 10% win rate for Amber Sapphire. Why is that the case? Well, as I mentioned earlier, Emerald Amethyst Burn is not exactly a board dependent deck. It plays just a flurry of 1-drops at the start of the game, quests to like 12, 13, and then starts playing Amethyst Chromicon and the Staticaster, and just starts playing burn from hand to gain lore from that point. You don't have any ways to reduce your opposing lore. There's nothing you can do once your opponent goes down that road. Your Raging Storms don't do anything, and if they just keep playing more characters and don't play burn and you just keep playing Raging Storms, you're just giving them more time to find the final points of lore that they can directly play from hand, which again you cannot stop. So matchup is really bad. Yes, this deck is very polarized. It has very big weaknesses. I suspect this deck might even struggle against more lore assertive mid-range decks like the Ruby Amethyst for set 10 that plays 2 questers early, Diablo and Sisu. So this deck has very clear weaknesses that it will suffer immensely against. But if the metagame is in this deck's favor, where it's slow grinding mid-range decks, this Amber Sapphire list is going to perform really well. For deck builders out there moving forward, if you're planning to play something grindy and mid-rangey and you want to go toe-to-toe with Amber Sapphire, fight through all the Raging Storms, you should keep in mind that playing item removal might become quite important to stop the Black Cauldron, because once that's going, that's quite unbeatable if the game is the type that's going to last to the point where players have like 20 cards left in deck. It goes on for like 30 turns or something. Get your wasabis ready! Just from first principles, I think this deck will also struggle against decks that have good discard that can play it on like turns 3 to 7. No real discard deck really exists currently. I've been trying on my end with little success, but if a deck that has a good discard package surfaces, then that will be good against Amber Sapphire as well, I think. If you want to pick this deck up, I do have a couple of pointers that I would like to raise just for you to consider. The first is, are you going to be playing Ludwig? Ludwig is a fantastic card, but it doesn't really slot in the early curve particularly well because you want to be ramping, and the opponent may not necessarily give you the opportunity to use Ludwig's second line of text to ramp. As I said, I've been playing Machiavelli's list without Ludwig and I've been quite enjoying it. I think Ludwig as an uninkable card might just be a little too small ball for this deck, but if there are certain actions that you think really give you problems, then maybe perhaps Ludwig might be something to consider to put in. As for playing the deck, I think it's relatively straightforward to play, but there are 1 or 2 minor things that I've noticed that you may want to think about. The first is, don't ink your removal too early. This is a common habit when you're playing any deck in Lorcana with actions and characters, right? You want to play your characters and deploy them every single turn. So you ink your Horseman Strikes, you ink your World's Greatest Criminal Minds, you ink your Let It Goes because you don't see a good use case for them until like turn 5 or 6. But in this deck, because the characters are quite few and they're not very good at brawling with the opposing characters, you're going to need your Let It Goes and your World's Greatest Criminal Minds and your Horseman Strikes. Try and play with the aim of conserving these as best as you can, of course keeping in mind the opposing matchup. So if you're playing against Dogs, World's Greatest Criminal Mind and Horseman Strikes are pretty bad. If you're playing against Blurple, World's Greatest Criminal Mind not fantastic, Horseman Strikes really good, and so forth. The second minor thing that occurred to me is that Eilonvi is not really a turn 1 play. If you think about it, you played on turn 1, and on turn 2 you play Tipo, but your opponent played like a Daisy Duck. You're not going to be able to use the support very effectively. It's only good if you have Eilonvi into Sail into Eilonvi and then you can challenge for 4, but that's kinda rare, depends on the hand of course. Generally, I've noticed that Eilonvi is better even later in the game, after a Cinderella, because you get to use the Cinderella trigger because Eilonvi is a princess, or as a quick additional character to surprise your opponent for Stitch 7. So it's worthwhile holding those Eilonvis in hand to trigger it for that. Or to use his support for World's Greatest Criminal Mind, which is not something that happens in the first 2 or 3 turns, it's something that happens only on turn 4, 5 or 6 or onward. So in my view, Eilonvi is not really something you play on turn 1 just to put it out there. You hold it in hand, maybe use it as ink, maybe to trigger Cinderella, or maybe to set up good trades for you later, or as a way to support your World's Greatest Criminal Mind should you draw into that during the game. So that's my primer for Amber Sapphire Control. Hope you've enjoyed the video. If there are any other decks you want me to cover or to discuss, happy to hear them in the comments. If you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers!